Be continuing our series today titled Advent Aftermath. And so Advent is this time of expectance that occurs from December 1st to December 24th. And it's this time of expectation for the birth of Jesus. And so for many of us, it's kind of that Christmas season where we're looking forward to the day in which we will celebrate the birth of Jesus. Advent is also the beginning of the Western liturgical year, if you know what that means. It's this time where the whole year kind of starts for many Christian traditions. But the story of the baby Jesus goes far beyond just the birth of Jesus. And so what we're looking at through this series is the stories that follow after the birth of Jesus. So it's still kind of a Christmassy series. So we're keeping Christmas alive. But it's also these stories that sometimes get missed or forgotten, or that we don't maybe put as much focus on during the Christmas season. So last week we covered the wise men coming to Jesus with gifts, and we saw multiple characters in that particular reality. We saw Herod, who was this kind of like tyrant king who reigned from 37 BC to 4 BC, and it's important to understand that like Herod suffered from like deep paranoia, which most people in his position did in that particular time and culture, because if you were a Roman leader in this particular culture, you never knew when your throne was going to be at risk of being overthrown, even by a family member. And so we know this was a serious concern for Herod, such a serious concern that he even killed members of his own family, including one of his wives. Like Herod was pretty evil in the sight of the individuals that he was in power over. And so that was known, like when Herod was upset, that like all the people were upset. And that's kind of the setting of the story. And so it's important to recognize before the Magi even come to Jesus, the wise men come to Jesus, there's this line about like Herod being kind of unsettled, and this being the entire setting of the story. So when we're reading the Bible, it's really important that we recognize settings and characters, because this story builds off of last week's story about the Magi, the story we will be looking at today. Now, the wise men, the Magi, they bring these gifts to Jesus and his family. These gifts, they represent affluence. The wise men and Magi were very, very, very affluent. Gold, then and now, represents wealth and value. The exotic spices such as frankincense would not normally be available within the budget of an average Jewish family, yet here they are being handed this particular spice. And then myrrh was administered in various forms, gummy paste or perfume or oil, and it was a very expensive perfume. It was burned in worship services or social gatherings as a fragrance. It was also used in first century for embalming. And so this is given to the family of Jesus, something very expensive. So gold, frankincense, and myrrh. In the second century church, these gifts took on the meaning of the gold representing royalty, the frankincense representing divinity, and then the myrrh representing the eventual death and burial, and all of these connected to Jesus. And so even the gifts represented something of the future of Jesus, looking as a king, royalty, divinity, connected to God, and then also the death and burial. Some estimate these gifts, we didn't talk about this last week, but some estimate these gifts could have been worth as much as $4 million in like modern times. Now, we know the position that Joseph and Mary are coming from. They're not coming from like wealthy families. That's not their background. And even if they were, they've been disconnected from their families. They're now kind of on their own. They're teenagers on their own, and they're handed potentially a $4 million gift. Now, we can't know exactly how much, because the truth is we're not given an amount of each of these, of like how much gold they're given, how much, of the other items they're given. So we don't know for sure, but we do know that what would be a typical gift in a royalty situation. And it seems as if the kings, these kings, magi, wise men, whatever you want to call them, come to Jesus worshiping as if he is a new king that has been born. And in those occasions, it would be a significant gift. And so now, this family from this very lowly circumstance is handed this wealthy gift. And then here's what immediately happens after, and this is where we pick up the story for today. So that was kind of the cliff notes of last week, which you can go back and listen to on the podcast if you'd like to. It's on our website. But here's where it picks up from there. When they, the Magi, had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Now, this has happened to Joseph before, so he's probably like, okay, this is just how we communicate now. You come to me in a dream, all right, and said, get up. Take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So the Magi have left, and here's the deal. They had met with Herod before they found Jesus, and in meeting with Herod, they were told to come back after they worshiped Jesus, to then come back and report to Herod all that they had learned about Jesus. The Magi chose not to. In choosing not to, that really frustrated Herod. And now Joseph is being told in a dream, get up, leave, hurry up. Now here's the deal. This dream isn't giving Joseph any information he didn't already likely have, or things that he wasn't already likely thinking. Sometimes we know what to do. We know the landscape of our situation. We probably know we need to go right instead of left, or we need to move and act here. But then, like, God gives us that extra nudge that says, yeah, do that. Go ahead. Like, it seems to be that's what's happening, because remember, everyone would have been on pins and needles at this point with Herod at this time. He was a deep concern for multiple people. So what happens next? So he got up, he did what the angel said, took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. This wasn't a planned move. They grabbed what they could in the middle of the night. Now, if you're going to be traveling this way, having some goods to trade and sell would be incredibly helpful. So you could say the Magi, the wise men, actually gave them the ability to make this necessary travel even possible. Like, because they now have these goods that they can utilize in this time. So it's interesting how these stories even connect to each other. What happens next is, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So the Magi don't report back to Herod, and this really frustrates somebody who's already very frustrated. Very frustrated again, just so we can recognize the situation. He's frustrated because he's getting reports of a new king that's been born in the area. And even a child king represents something of a threat to his power, to his authority, and to his throne. And so for him, he's really concerned about this. He's really worried about this, very frustrated. Even more frustrated when he tells the Magi to report back and they refuse to report back. They go out of their way not to come back. Herod can't seem to find this new baby king on his own, with his own resources. So based on the timeline he's put together from when the reports first came about of this king and from what he had heard from the Magi when he had the conversation with them, Herod decides to kill all the boys that are 2 years old and under to ensure the new baby king isn't a threat to his throne. Now this tells us likely that Jesus is 2 or under at the time of this traveling. Like that Herod probably has the right timeline put together. So this is what Herod decides to do. What happens next is, then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. I'm not sure we can even imagine the sheer terror that would be invoked in this reality. Bethlehem would have been a place of great grief. Families having their infants and toddlers ripped from their hands, likely murdered in front of them. Like this would have been a brutal scene, certainly. And the author paints that picture. Now, then the author fast forwards. After Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel." Again, Joseph's like, this is just how we communicate, apparently. For those who were trying to take the child's life are dead. So another dream, he goes back, And it's likely at this point that Jesus is between the ages of 2 and 4. Most scholars, I think, would point to likely more toward like 4. Now, there's a variety of reasons it could be on the younger or on the older side, but that would be the idea that most would have. So here's what Joseph does. Again, he follows. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. So Joseph makes a judgment call here. He's like, there's someone in power that's kind of just as wicked as Herod, continuing on his legacy of his father. I don't think Bethlehem's a viable option. So he chooses, it says, having been warned in a dream again. So he's warned again. He withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in the town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So at some point he chooses not to go back to Bethlehem, probably somewhere stays outside of that region. Then gets a dream. Let's go back to Nazareth. Nazareth is home. And so this is where Mary and Joseph would have grown up. And they choose to go back to this particular region. Now, there's reasons not to go back. They probably have a complicated family life at this point because they got married out of wedlock. They brought a lot of shame onto their family. But they're probably like, so the shame of going back and living with our mom and dad next door is a little different than the potential of being murdered. So they choose to go back to this particular region. They are back home. Now, I want to show you that particular region because I was actually in that region. This is actually a church. When I was in Nazareth, here we are. This is the church here. And then if you go, the next I have is a video. And I'll set up the video before we play it. This is called Mary's Well. And a lot of people believe like this is where Mary was told she was pregnant. I don't know about all of that. But ultimately, it was the only well in the city. So we know for a fact that like in ancient days, this would have been a place where Mary and Joseph would have come to draw water, would have been the place where the town gathered even in the first century. Even at the time, even Jesus would have gathered around this particular spring of water because it was the only spring of water in this particular town. So it's very interesting. Now there's a church that's built upon it. You'll hear the water kind of rushing through the spring. So give it a listen. So this is in a church. People will come in here and pray. I actually had to stand there for a while just to wait for a moment to film where someone wasn't coming in there and praying or leaving things. And so this is in the same exact place where they fled back to and where Jesus is ultimately raised. And next week, we'll be looking at the story of Jesus as a young boy and looking into that particular story. But before we get into that, a few points about this particular story, because I think this story that we just read today has a lot of connections to our life and to our world and to the way we read the Bible. First, this story is very interesting in that it has been challenged by many scholars as whether or not it is a factual story. There is no evidence historically of a massacre of children 2 and under by Herod. And Josephus, a Jewish historian who documented much of Herod and the kings that followed, never mentions any of this in his documentation, which is interesting because this would seem like something Josephus would document in the order of things that he documents. Now, it could be that the massacre was very regionalized and there just wasn't a whole lot of kids 2 years old and under, like in the particular population. It could be that Josephus left it out for reasons we don't know. It could be that it never actually happened. And it could be that the first readers of the gospel account knew it never actually happened. Now, for us, and the way we're taught to read the Bible, you probably have alarm bells ringing in your head when I say, this might not have actually literally ever happened, right? Be honest if that makes you uncomfortable, right? Like, we've been trained to read the Bible a certain way that if I stand up here and say, wow, we don't have a whole lot of historical evidence for that happening, I'm not sure if that happened. The first thing you say is, well, the Bible said it, it's true, I believe it, and that's how I've ordered my life. That's how I've been trained to read the Bible. I've been trained to read it literally. And I think it's far more valuable to read the Bible literally than literally. And especially this story, because I think this story has value on both sides. It's not that one way is the way to read it and one way isn't. The truth is the story is disputed. We're not confident one way or another whether or not the story happened or not. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not here to make you believe that it actually happened or to push you to believe it didn't happen. The truth is, I don't know. I believe it very well could have happened exactly as it's documented here. I also believe it very well could be to connect Jesus to his broader history, to the broader Jewish history. In the first century, truth was not the way we view truth today. It was not about measurability, observability, scientific. It wasn't about accuracy of the details. They had not gone through the age of enlightenment. And so for them, those markers of what made a story true were not there. They're the markers that we use. Like, if I was to tell you a particular reality about U.S. history, I would emphasize facts. Someone in a Jewish context would emphasize the things that connected them to their culture. These are two very different ways of communicating truth. The truth of a character in a story was far more linked to how it connected to the roots of the tribe or tradition or the character that could be shown as being one of us. In this case, shown as being Jewish. So how does this story connect Jesus to the lineage of the Jewish heroes of the faith? Who is one of the largest heroes of the Jewish faith? Moses. Probably one of the greatest heroes of the Jewish faith. So in the time of Moses, maybe we can remember, if we just flash back to that story for a moment, there happened to be a tyrant king. His name was Pharaoh. Do some of us remember this story maybe? Maybe we saw it on a flannel board in Sunday school growing up. I don't know. But we know Pharaoh decided at one point to kill all the infant boys. Does this sound familiar? Are we triggering in our head? Oh, interesting. That's a connection. Did Moses narrowly escape that? Well, yes, Moses did narrowly escape that. How? His family was in a low position, similar to Jesus. They were slaves in Egypt, actually, so even in a worse position. They floated him down a river, targeting the royal family, hoping that the royal family would take in Moses as their own. And they did. So Moses had to go further into Egypt to survive, to be saved in infant death. Interesting. Are we starting to see the connection between what might be being communicated about Jesus and his place and connection to being even as important or more important than Moses? Then Moses came out of Egypt, led his people out of Egypt, providing freedom to God's people. The author could be creating a modern day connection. Now, it could be that the circumstances are simply creating the connection, and it really happened. And it could be that the author is creating the connection. It is possible that it is not true in the sense of a 21st century truth, but it is true that Jesus represents a new Savior, a new Moses, connected to the Jewish heroes of faith, but taking this story even further and providing salvation and freedom and leading the people out of bondage to salvation and inviting all people to this, not just the Israelites. The potential that it didn't actually happen wouldn't lessen the impact for the first readers. The first readers would have been just as enamored with the story because of the way in which it connected Jesus to their roots, to their heroes. So I say that just to say because, again, I don't have a dog in the fight, but either way, whether it is positioning Jesus in the tradition of a Jewish hero for the sake of pointing to the salvation that's ultimately going to exist through him, or this is a factual events that actually occurred, it's an interesting thing to consider because it challenges the way we read the Bible. It says we have to come to the Bible acknowledging the reality of the literature itself. Sometimes the Bible is really clearly, historically, giving us an accurate, like scientifically accurate picture of what took place. Other times, it's drawing on the narratives of its day to connect characters to one another for the sake of deepening the roots of that character within the tribe. Ultimately, to kind of hammer home the importance of them within the community. And obviously, the author of this book saw Jesus as the most important in Jewish history. And so to connect to Moses would be vital and important for your audience to see that connection. Now, there's another thing this story does. Jesus takes the position of a refugee. I find this fascinating and interesting. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are fleeing violence for the sake of survival, and they have to cross a border and seek shelter in another country. These Jewish people seeking asylum when in political danger often fled to Egypt, which is also very interesting, right? Egypt, being once a place of bondage that represented within the Jewish narrative, is now a place of freedom and hope. We know that there was a large Jewish population in Alexandria in Egypt, because at that particular time, that was the place in which people would seek refuge if they were at the potential cost of violence within Israel's place with being occupied by Rome. And so this is likely where Jesus and his family end up, in Alexandria. Based on historical evidence, that's what we would guesstimate. Now, this is relevant for our lives today, that Jesus was a refugee. The King of Kings was once a refugee fleeing violence and seeking asylum. We cannot be sure what that process was like for Jesus, if the goods provided by the Magi helped the border crossing go smoothly. What we do know is that Jesus took the position, or was placed in the position, of a refugee even as a baby. And this is important for us because today we face a refugee crisis in our world. Relief Web estimated that in 2019, an unprecedented 70.8 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide, and 37,000 people are forced to flee their homes every day due to conflict and persecution. 37,000 people completely uprooted daily on average. Now, obviously, war is part of this reality. There's all kinds of markers, poverty, unstable countries, all kinds of different things. But ultimately, this is a crisis in our world right now. And over the last few years, it's increased. The numbers continue to increase. Now, I'm fully aware that I'm stepping into a conversation that probably has everybody a little bit like, where's he going with this? Okay? Border policy is a deeply political issue. And many of us in this room probably occupy various positions for various reasons with various desired outcomes. I am not interested in challenging your political affiliation or political ideology. I am, however, interested in challenging how you order your life, especially how Jesus and the words of Jesus order your priorities and how you see the world and how you care for others. I would have no problem challenging the way you order the teachings of Jesus in your life. So with that said, I think it's really important that we recognize the Bible is not silent, even far before Jesus ever comes and becomes a refugee, by the way. The Bible is not silent on how we are to treat the refugee. These are just some verses I pulled today, and I'm not going to read the whole verse. I'll just kind of summarize it. You can go read these verses on your own if you'd like to, okay? Love refugees as yourself. Leave food for the poor and the foreigner. God loves the foreigner residing among you. The sin of Sodom, by the way, Sodom and Gomorrah, if you know that story, the sin that's actually referenced to them is they did not help the poor and the needy, especially the refugee, by the way. Do not oppress a foreigner. Do not deprive foreigners among you of justice. Do whatever the foreigner asks of you. Oh, wow. Be careful on that one. Might want to take that one out. Leave your door open to the traveler. Oh, uh-oh. Invite the stranger in. That's actually the words of Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Have mercy on your neighbor. We were all baptized by one Spirit. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, if you remember that particular passage. Make foreigners part of the community. And then finally, our story today, Jesus was a refugee. And by the way, there's far more than that I could probably go into. But ultimately, the Bible is full of stories and passages that encourage a welcomeness to the refugee, ultimately emphasizing the fact that the refugee is in a position of weakness, in a position of often fleeing, being away from their home, a position where they're in need. And if you have the means to care for that person's need, there's literally a passage that says, if you see your neighbor in need, and you have the means to meet that need, and you choose not to, the question that's placed, how can the love of God be in you? The scripture seems clear. And so how do passages like this reconcile with these kinds of living conditions? And I say this fully aware of the reality that some of you are going to accuse me of opening up a political door and talk. I'm not here to talk politics. I'm not here in connection to a particular tribe, a particular viewpoint, a particular way. I'm just saying, like, if anyone should say there's something wrong here, it should be the church first and foremost, those who look to the Bible and look to the life of Jesus and say, what? Hold on, we can do better than this. Yes, it's a struggle, but could you imagine having your children taken from you if you're here and you're a parent? Ultimately, because you're fleeing a violent situation, you've lost your home, you've maybe lost everything. To be placed in, to have your kids placed in a warehouse type facility, separated by fencing. Some would even call it being caged or jailed. How does this actual image of the circumstances reconcile with our faith? These are questions we should be asking as the church, especially when we read about a story of Jesus being a refugee. And unfortunately, it even gets worse. These are children who have died in our country's custody. This is Felipe Gomez Alonso, 8 years old, from Guatemala. This is Jacqueline Kale McKean, 7, Guatemala. This is Juan de Leon Gutierrez, 16, Guatemala. This is Carlos Hernandez Vasquez, 16, Guatemala. This is Darlene Cristobal Cordova Valle, 10, El Salvador. Wilmer Jose Ramirez Vasquez, 2.5, Guatemala. All children who have died at our border, in our custody, many separated from their families, dying of treatable illnesses. Now, I know where some of you are going to go, because I've had conversations with people, but Justin, it's super complicated. Yes, you're right. It's super complicated. There's no easy answer to the situations we're dealing with at our border. I would 100% agree with you. It's super complicated. We're dealing with what I already said is a crisis. We're seeing far more people seeking asylum than in at least my history of seeing this particular crisis. And I even want to give some more credence to that side, to say the Border Patrol has a lot to work through and discern, because there are some people who are coming with a cousin or a nephew or a friend's child. And the question is, Border Patrol has to determine, is this person here for the sake of trying to traffic this child? Like, that's a real concern, and we should acknowledge that as a real concern. Human trafficking is a real thing in our world, and it could be that someone's posing as trying to get into our country in that situation, and ultimately they mean harm to this child, and ultimately it's a different kind of evil that exists, not the evil of being displaced, but the evil of trying to traffic. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying there's an easy answer, but here's what I am saying. On this particular subject, don't tell me we can't champion for diverting more resources to solving this problem, to solving this crisis, to championing compassion over fear. Like, and again, we spend billions of dollars on all kinds of other things, including things that aren't really bringing people together. These are human lives. These are image bearers of God. And even more, these images represent Jesus. Like, there's this story of the sheep and the goats, and I'll close with this. And leave these up on the screen while I say this. There's the story of the sheep and the goats. And at the end of the story, there's this group of people who are like, when did we ever see you naked? When did we ever see you hungry? When did we ever see you a stranger and not let you in? And Jesus shares in this story, when you saw them, the least of these, you saw me. What I would ask is, when we see these faces, when we hear these news reports, are we seeing someone we're afraid of, or are we seeing Jesus? Are we seeing something our particular political tribe has given us a narrative about, or are we seeing Jesus? Because Jesus would say we should be seeing Jesus when we see these people. So, a story, an ancient story about Jesus crossing a border with his family has huge implications in a world where we're still trying to figure out what to do with refugees. We're still trying to figure out how exactly compassion works in this economy of asylum seekers. And I don't have the exact answers, but what I do have is this. If you're not seeing these people and saying, wow, that could be Jesus, let's start there. I don't know how to fix the problem. I'm not the person who answers that, but I am the person who says, look, you can't ignore the reality that Scripture says a lot on this subject. And it's always tilted toward compassion, love, grace, understanding, forgiveness, hospitality, being charitable toward those who are in this kind of a position. Let's pray. God, we come to you and we ask that you would grow our capacity for compassion, grow our capacity for understanding, birth in us the love that exists ultimately in you. As hard as that reality is, as hard as our hearts are on many different subjects, remind us the importance of life and the importance of loving our neighbor as ourselves and the importance of seeing you in the least of these. And this is just one area of the least of these. There are homeless right here in our community. There are people who need food right here in our community. God, may we have eyes to see you in the hurting, to see you in the least of these, those that are in our midst and those that might be far away, God. And grow within us a compassion to meet that need, God. God, I pray that wherever we have fallen short on this, that your grace and mercy would be for us, and that we would receive that and accept that. And ultimately that you would continue to place in us your desire for our life. God, your purpose for our life. that we would see how you desire us to navigate some of these complex issues in our world. God, be with us. May we have your heart in the way in which we live in this world, the way in which we operate, the way in which we champion compassion. In your name, amen.